I never thought my life could unravel so quickly. Up until that moment, everything seemed predictable. A stable job, a cozy home, and a wife I had been married to for 10 years. Sure, Carol and I had our disagreements, like any couple, but I was convinced our bond was strong enough to withstand whatever came our way. I thought nothing could shake the foundation of what we had built together. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing you off course, and it all started with a simple decision: the decision to take a break from the routine and go on a trip. I wanted to explore, find some inspiration, maybe reignite the passion I once had for cooking, and immerse myself in a different culture. Carol wasn't particularly thrilled about it. She thought the idea was reckless, a waste of time and money, but I felt a deep urge to escape, to get out of the day-to-day grind and experience something new. I never imagined that this trip would be the beginning of the end. I decided to travel to a small South American country, one that was known for its vibrant food scene and rich culture. The idea was simple: spend a couple of months backpacking, learning new recipes, and maybe even find some peace of mind along the way. But what I found was far from peaceful. The first few weeks were exhilarating: the sights, the smells, the people. It felt like I was finally doing something worthwhile. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. But that feeling didn't last long. One night, after a long day of exploring, I found myself in a local bar, trying to unwind. The place was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat and alcohol. I sat at the bar nursing a drink when a fight broke out near the back. Chairs flew, glasses shattered, and before I knew it, I was being dragged into the chaos. I didn't even know how it happened, but suddenly, I was caught in the middle of a brawl that had nothing to do with me. Someone swung at me, and before I could react, I was on the ground, my head spinning. I didn't throw a punch, I didn't defend myself, but none of that mattered. The local authorities arrived shortly after, and they didn't bother sorting out who was guilty and who wasn't. They rounded everyone up, including me, and threw us into the back of a truck like cattle. I tried to explain that I wasn't involved, that I was just a tourist, but no one was listening. The language barrier didn't help. I was just another foreigner in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next morning, I found myself in a small, dark cell. The walls were damp, the air heavy with the stench of mildew and sweat. I had no idea where I was or how long I would be stuck there. Panic started to set in as I realized just how bad things had gotten. This wasn't some misunderstanding that would be cleared up with a phone call. I was in real trouble, and I had no way of contacting Carol or anyone else back home. Days turned into weeks, and the hope that Carol would somehow find out what happened to me kept me going. I imagined her worried, frantically trying to figure out where I was. I pictured her calling embassies, hiring private investigators, doing whatever she could to bring me home. The thought of her kept me sane. I clung to the idea that she would save me, that she hadn't given up on me. But as the months dragged on, that hope began to fade. The guards were cruel, the other prisoners worse. Every day felt like a battle just to survive. I had no idea if anyone knew where I was or if I would ever get out. I started to question everything. Was I ever going to see her again? Did she even know I was alive? After 15 months of hell, the unthinkable happened. I was released. It was sudden, without explanation. One day, the guards came to my cell, threw my belongings at me, and told me to get out. I didn't ask questions, I just left, grateful to finally be free. But as I made my way back home, I began to realize that freedom was just the beginning of a new nightmare. I stepped off the plane and into a world that felt foreign, even though I was home. It had been over a year since I had seen my city, and everything seemed different. Or maybe it was just me. I had changed, hardened by the months of isolation and despair. My body still ached from the prison beatings, and my mind felt like it was trapped in the same cell I'd been locked in for so long. All I wanted was to get back to Carol, to feel her arms around me and know that everything was going to be all right again. That hope had been the only thing keeping me alive for the past 15 months. I pictured her face every night before I fell asleep, imagined the moment when I would finally walk through the door and be greeted by her tearful embrace. I thought it would be a moment of relief, of finally being home. but nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I got there. As I stood outside our house, something felt off. The lawn was overgrown, weeds sprouting through the cracks in the driveway. The front porch light was off, and the curtains were drawn. It didn't look like the home I remembered. I knocked on the door, heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see Carol's face appear at any second. But when the door finally creaked open, it wasn't her. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stood in the doorway. He looked confused, like he wasn't expecting company. I must have looked like a ghost to him, standing there dirty and gaunt, my clothes hanging off my frame. For a moment, neither of us said a word. "Can I help you?" he finally asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of suspicion. "Where's Carol?" I asked, my voice cracking from the dryness in my throat. "This is my house. I'm her husband." The man blinked, his eyes narrowing as he processed what I had just said. A tense silence hung between us before he finally responded, and the words that came out of his mouth hit me like a freight train. "Carol's not here. She doesn't live here anymore. She's with me now. We're together." I couldn't move. My legs felt like they had turned to stone, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. With him? What the hell did that mean? "Wait, what do you mean she's with you? I just got out. I've been away," I stammered, not able to finish the sentence. "Where is she?" The man sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He glanced over his shoulder, as if hoping Carol would suddenly appear and clear up the confusion. But she didn't. "Look, man," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I don't know what happened to you, but Carol moved on. She told me you were gone, that you had disappeared without a trace. She waited for a while, but she thought you were dead. She's with me now. We've been together for months." Dead? That word echoed in my head, each repetition driving the knife deeper into my chest. She thought I was dead? After everything we had been through, she gave up on me that easily? I had clung to the idea of her, fought to stay alive because I believed she was out there waiting for me. And now it was as if I never even existed. I pushed past him, stepping inside the house that used to be mine. It still looked familiar, but there were subtle changes everywhere. New furniture, different artwork on the walls. It wasn't our house anymore, it was theirs. The man followed me in but didn't try to stop me. He could probably tell I was barely holding myself together. "Carol's not here right now," he said quietly, "but she filed for divorce a while ago. It's already finalized." I froze. Divorce? Finalized? My mind couldn't process the words. How could she have done this? I was alive. I was here. How could she have erased me so easily? "When she found out you were gone, she didn't know what else to do," the man continued. "She thought you'd never come back." I turned around, staring at him in disbelief. "You're telling me she didn't even try to find me? She didn't call anyone, didn't do anything to figure out what happened to me?" He shook his head slowly. "She didn't know where to start. You just disappeared. After a few months, she assumed the worst. It was hard on her, man. She was grieving. She loved you. But then things changed." I didn't care about his explanations. I didn't care about his excuses. All I could think about was the fact that the woman I loved had moved on without me, had built a new life while I was rotting away in a foreign prison. The life I had known, the life I had dreamed of coming back to, was gone, and with it, everything that had kept me sane. I stormed out of the house, not bothering to hear any more of his attempts to explain what had happened. My world was spinning, collapsing in on itself. I couldn't think straight, couldn't breathe. How had everything gone so wrong? How had I lost everything? As I walked aimlessly through the streets, trying to wrap my head around the reality I had just stepped into, one thing became clear. I wasn't going to let this slide. Carol might have moved on, but I wasn't ready to. She thought she could erase me, that I would disappear quietly, but she was wrong. This wasn't over. After leaving the house, I wandered the streets for hours. The city I once knew felt cold and distant, as if it, too, had forgotten me. My mind was racing, replaying every moment with Carol, every sign I had missed. Was there something I had overlooked before I left? Could I have seen this coming? No, I had been so blinded by love, so convinced that our bond was unbreakable, that I never thought to question anything. But now, everything was different. Carol had moved on. She had found comfort in another man's arms and let go of me as if I had been nothing more than a fleeting memory. And while part of me wanted to collapse under the weight of that realization, another part, the darker, angrier part, started to take control. She had erased me, forgotten me, replaced me. I wasn't going to let her get away with that. She thought I would disappear quietly. She thought I would accept this. Not a chance. I needed a plan, and as much as I hated to admit it, I wasn't thinking clearly enough to come up with one on my own. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called the one person who had always been there for me in the past. Juliet. Juliet and I had been friends for years, long before Carol came into the picture. We had lost touch over the last few years, mainly because Carol never liked her. She thought Juliet was a bad influence, too blunt, too wild. But Juliet had been one of the few people in my life who told it like it was, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. I didn't know if she would even pick up, but when she answered the phone, it was like a lifeline. Simon, oh my God, is that you? Where have you been? I heard you went on some trip and then nothing. Her voice was filled with genuine concern, something I hadn't heard in so long that it almost broke me right then and there. But I held it together. I need to talk, I said, my voice cracking. Can you meet me? Juliet didn't ask questions. She just said yes, like I knew she would. We agreed to meet at a bar downtown, a place we used to hang out before life got complicated. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner booth, her eyes scanning the room nervously until they landed on me. Jesus, Simon, you look different, she said as I sat down across from her. I could tell by her tone that different wasn't a compliment. I must have looked like a ghost, thinner, more gaunt, like someone who had been through hell. And I had. It's been a rough year, I muttered, staring down at my hands. I didn't know where to start, how to explain everything that had happened. But I didn't need to. Juliet had always been able to read me better than anyone. What happened? She asked gently, her voice softening. Where have you been all this time? I took a deep breath and told her everything. The trip, the wrongful arrest, the months in that miserable prison, and then, finally, my return to a life that wasn't mine anymore. As I spoke, her face shifted from shock to anger, and by the time I finished, she was clenching her fists on the table. That bitch, she spat, her voice low but full of fury. She just moved on? Didn't even try to find you? After everything you've been through? I nodded, feeling a twisted sense of relief that someone finally understood the rage that had been building inside me. So, what are you going to do? Juliet asked, her eyes sharp and focused. She was always like this, ready to take action, ready to fight back. I don't know, I admitted, but I can't just let it go. She replaced me. She's living with some guy in our house. They think I'm just going to disappear quietly, but I'm not. I want her to pay. Juliet smirked, her eyes gleaming with a kind of wickedness I hadn't seen in a long time. Oh, Simon, you came to the right person. You want revenge? I'll help you. The weight of those words hung between us, and in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. Juliet wasn't the kind of person who backed down once a decision was made. She was all in, and now, so was I. We spent the next few hours mapping out a plan. It wasn't about petty revenge or doing something rash. No, we wanted to dismantle Carol's new life piece by piece. She thought she could erase me? She thought she could move on with that guy and live happily ever after? We were going to make sure that wouldn't happen. The first step was to gather information. Juliet had connections, people who could dig up dirt, and she knew how to get it without leaving a trace. We needed to know everything: who this new guy was, what kind of life they were building together, and most importantly, what weaknesses we could exploit. Juliet had a way of finding out people's secrets, and I knew she would leave no stone unturned. As the night went on, the alcohol dulled the edge of my anger, but it didn't extinguish it. The more we talked, the more I realized that I didn't just want Carol to hurt. I wanted her to understand what she had done to me. She needed to know that you couldn't just erase someone from your life without facing the consequences. And that's when Juliet said something that stuck with me. Simon, the best revenge isn't just about making her pay, it's about making her regret ever thinking she could live without you. I looked at her, and for the first time since I had come home, I smiled. She was right. This wasn't just about destroying her new life, it was about making her realize what she had lost, making her see that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't simply erase me. I wasn't going anywhere. The next few days felt like I was moving through a fog, but with a purpose now. Juliet had lit a fire under me, and for the first time since I had returned, I didn't feel lost. I had a plan, and even though it wasn't exactly noble, it felt like the only thing that made sense. Carol had erased me, built a new life without a second thought, and now it was time for her to understand what that really meant. She wasn't going to walk away unscathed, not after what she'd done. Juliet worked fast. I had always known she was resourceful, but watching her pull strings and make things happen so quickly was impressive. She knew people in all the right places, private investigators, tech-savvy friends who could dig up dirt online, and even a few people who worked in finance. Within a week, she had gathered enough information to start tearing Carol's world apart. The first thing we found out was that the man Carol was with, Mitch, wasn't just some random guy. He was well off, successful, and the worst part, he was using my money to fund the life they were building together. It turned out that while I was rotting in that hellhole of a prison, Carol had gotten access to my accounts. Whether she assumed I was dead or just didn't care, she had started draining the savings we had built together. I could have forgiven her for moving on, maybe even for finding someone else, but using my money to fuel her new life? That was the last straw. Juliet's eyes gleamed when she showed me the financial records. Looks like she thought you weren't coming back, so she figured she might as well take what's yours. Classic move. But don't worry, Simon. We're going to hit her where it hurts. We knew we had to be smart about it. I didn't want to do anything illegal or something that would land me back in another prison cell. But Juliet had a way of navigating these situations. Always careful, always one step ahead. She suggested we start small, subtle. We weren't going to ruin them overnight. No, this was going to be slow, methodical. The kind of destruction you don't see coming until it's too late. The first move was to freeze the accounts. Juliet knew someone who could pull a few strings and put a temporary hold on everything. Carol wouldn't be able to access the money she had been so freely spending. The beauty of it was that it wouldn't look like I had done anything. It would appear to her as just a bureaucratic hiccup, some issue with the bank. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would be too late. Next, we needed to dig into Mitch. The more we found out about him, the more it became clear that he wasn't exactly clean. On the surface, he looked like the perfect partner. Successful, charming, financially stable. But beneath all that, there were cracks. His business dealings were shady, to say the least. He had cut corners, made enemies, and there were rumors about some questionable deals that hadn't yet come to light. Juliet was convinced that if we dug deep enough, we'd find something that would not only ruin him, but also drag Carol down with him. Simon, trust me, she said one evening, as we sifted through more documents and records. When people like Mitch fall, they fall hard. And Carol? She's standing right there next to him. When his world crumbles, she's going down with him. It was strange, this new feeling inside me. I had spent months in that prison, helpless, with nothing but the thought of Carol to keep me going. I had believed she was my salvation, the person who would fight for me, who would never give up. But now, seeing her for what she really was, a woman who had chosen herself over us, who had used my absence to rebuild her life on my ruins, I felt nothing but cold determination. She had made her choice, and now she was going to have to live with the consequences. The real turning point came when Juliet discovered that Mitch's business was on shaky ground. He had invested heavily in a project that wasn't panning out, and if things didn't turn around soon, he was going to lose a lot of money. Carol had no idea, of course. To her, Mitch was the stable, secure future she thought she needed. She probably had no clue that the foundation of their new life was already crumbling. Juliet smiled when she shared the news. It's perfect, Simon. We don't even need to do anything drastic. We just need to give that little nudge, and Mitch's whole world will fall apart on its own. And when it does, Carol will be left with nothing. As the days passed, I found myself becoming more and more focused on the plan. It consumed me, gave me something to latch onto. I wasn't just the guy who'd been left behind anymore. I was the one pulling the strings now. And the more I learned about Mitch and Carol, the more justified I felt in what I was doing. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. They had taken everything from me, and now I was taking it back. But there was something else, too. The more time I spent with Juliet, the more I started to see her in a different light. She wasn't just the wild, carefree friend I had known years ago. She was smart, determined, and more loyal than anyone I'd ever known. She had been there for me when no one else was, and I started to wonder if maybe there was more between us than just friendship. It was a strange feeling. After everything that had happened with Carol, I hadn't thought I could ever trust someone again. But with Juliet, things felt different. One night, after another long evening of planning and strategizing, Juliet looked at me with a softness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Simon," she said quietly, "I know you want to make them pay, and I'll be here with you every step of the way. But just remember, there's life after this. There's more than just revenge." Her words lingered in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Revenge had been the only thing on my mind for so long that I hadn't even considered what would happen afterward. What would my life look like once Carol and Mitch's world came crashing down? Could I move on? Could I build something new? Juliet's hand brushed against mine, and I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like years. Maybe there was something beyond revenge. Maybe there was something worth rebuilding after all. But first, I had to finish what I started. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning and waiting. Juliet and I had set everything in motion, and now it was just a matter of time before the cracks we had uncovered started to deepen. Mitch's business was already teetering on the edge, and all it needed was a little push. Juliet had been keeping a close eye on things, and every day the tension built as we got closer to seeing the dominoes fall. I hadn't seen Carol since that day I showed up at the house, and honestly, I wasn't sure how I'd feel when I did. Anger, resentment, betrayal, they were all there, swirling inside me, but there was something else too. A part of me still couldn't shake the memories of our life together. The years we had spent building a life, the plans we had made for the future. It felt like a lifetime ago now, like I had been living someone else's life. But there was no going back. Carol had made her choices, and now I had made mine. This was the path we were on, and I was ready to see it through. Juliet's plan was simple but effective. We didn't need to do anything drastic. Mitch's business was hanging by a thread, and all we had to do was pull it. With the connections Juliet had, we were able to discreetly tip off some of his competitors about his failing project. It was enough to make them pull out of deals, leaving Mitch with a sinking ship. He had no idea that the very people he had trusted were now backing away, leaving him vulnerable. Carol, of course, was oblivious to it all. She still saw Mitch as her way out, her new beginning. I could only imagine what was going on in her head. She probably thought she had traded up, that she had found someone who could give her the life I never could. But that was about to change. The financial freeze on the accounts had started to take effect. Juliet's contact had managed to stall things just long enough to cause some frustration without making it look suspicious. Carol would have noticed by now that something was wrong. The money she had been relying on wasn't as accessible as she thought, and Mitch wasn't in a position to bail her out. His own finances were stretched thin, and he was scrambling to keep everything from falling apart. We watched it all unfold from a distance. Juliet had contacts everywhere, and we received updates regularly. Mitch's failed deals, the growing tension between him and Carol, the mounting pressure from creditors. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, and I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. This was what they deserved. But there was one final piece of the puzzle that needed to fall into place, and it was something Juliet had been working on in the background without me knowing. One night, as we sat in her apartment, going over the latest updates, she dropped the bombshell. "I've got something that's going to push this over the edge," she said. Her voice calm, but with a glint in her eye that told me she had something big. I looked up from the papers we were reviewing. "What do you mean?" "We've already done enough damage. Mitch's business is hanging by a thread." Juliet smiled, that mischievous smile I had come to know so well. "Oh, I know, but this is personal." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Mitch isn't just a businessman. He's a cheater. And not just with Carol." I blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about?" Juliet pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages, photos, and receipts. Mitch had been cheating on Carol for months. He had a whole other life on the side, with another woman, and he had been spending money on her, too. Money that Carol had probably assumed was going toward their future. "This guy's a piece of work," Juliet said, shaking her head. "He's not just using Carol, he's using everyone. He thinks he can get away with it, but we're about to make sure that doesn't happen." For a moment, I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. Carol had traded me in for Mitch, thinking he was her savior, only to find out he was just as much of a liar as she was. But another part of me felt something else. Not pity exactly, but a strange sense of closure. Carol had thought she could erase me from her life and move on without a second thought, but now she was about to get a taste of what it felt like to be betrayed. Juliet had already figured out how to get the information to Carol without it coming back to us. A simple anonymous email, with enough evidence to leave no doubt in her mind. It wouldn't take much, just a few key details, a couple of photos, and the truth would hit her like a freight train. Mitch wasn't the man she thought he was. He wasn't her future. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Juliet nodded, her expression serious. "She needs to know, Simon. She needs to understand what she's done. And Mitch? He's going to learn that he can't play with people's lives and get away with it." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all settle over me. This was it, the final move. Carol had erased me from her life, but now it was my turn to erase her illusions. She had chosen Mitch over me, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. The email went out the next morning. Juliet had made sure it was untraceable, sent from an anonymous account with just enough information to make Carol question everything. We didn't have to wait long to see the fallout. Within days, the cracks in their relationship became public. Mitch's business was crumbling, and now, so was his personal life. Juliet and I watched from the sidelines as everything fell apart. Carol tried to confront Mitch, but he denied it, as expected. He lied to her face, just like he had lied to everyone else. But the evidence was there, undeniable. And it wasn't long before Carol realized she had been played. The satisfaction I felt was cold, but it was real. I wasn't the broken man she had left behind anymore. I had taken control, turned the tables, and as I watched her life unravel, I realized something important. I didn't need her to suffer. I didn't need her to feel the pain I had felt. Because I had already won. I had taken back my life, my dignity, and my future. Juliet was right. There was life after revenge. And as we sat there together, watching the final pieces of Carol's world collapse, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was ready to move on. The email had done its job. Carol's perfect little world with Mitch was unraveling faster than I had imagined. The truth about his affair hit her hard, and she wasn't quiet about it. In a matter of days, the fallout was in full swing. The whispers started first. People in their social circle began talking, sharing rumors about Mitch's double life. Soon enough, it was all over the place. Juliet and I kept our distance, watching from afar as the destruction unfolded. It was almost surreal. After all the months of planning and anger building up inside me, I expected some kind of explosive moment when it all came crashing down. But it wasn't loud, it was slow, methodical, and messy. Just the way we had planned. Mitch tried to deny everything at first. Typical. He must have thought he could charm his way out of it. Maybe even convince Carol that the photos were fake, that the texts were some kind of elaborate setup. But the evidence was too clear, too damning. Carol wasn't stupid. She had been fooled by Mitch once, but this was too much to ignore. The fights started almost immediately. It was hard to ignore them. Neighbors began hearing the shouting through the walls. Carol's voice sharp and accusing, Mitch's low and defensive. It didn't take long before she kicked him out. The rumors about his crumbling business must have reached her around the same time, because everything seemed to implode at once. Mitch was finished, both professionally and personally, and Carol was left standing in the wreckage of the life she thought she had built. Juliet and I were out one night grabbing drinks at one of our old favorite spots. When the news finally reached us, Mitch had left town. Apparently, he was in so much financial trouble that he couldn't afford to stay. From what we gathered, he had burned too many bridges with his business partners, and now he had no one left to back him up. The man had been living a lie, just like his relationship with Carol. And now he was gone. Ah, good riddance, Juliet said with a smirk, raising her glass to toast his departure. One down, one to go. But the strange thing was, as I sat there swirling the beer in my glass, I didn't feel the same sense of triumph I had expected. Sure, Mitch was gone and Carol was left to pick up the pieces, but now that it was done, I didn't feel the same fire. The satisfaction I had felt was fading, leaving behind a strange emptiness. For months, my life had revolved around getting revenge on Carol and Mitch. Now that it was over, I couldn't help but wonder, what was next? Juliet seemed to notice the shift in me. She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. What's going on in that head of yours, Simon? This was what you wanted, right? I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Yeah, it's what I wanted. But was it? The truth was, I had spent so long wrapped up in the idea of revenge that I hadn't thought about what would happen afterward. Mitch was gone, and Carol was probably realizing she had made the worst mistake of her life. But none of that changed the fact that I was still alone, still dealing with the fallout of everything I had been through. The anger that had fueled me for so long was starting to drain, leaving me with nothing but questions. Juliet didn't push. She never did. She just let me sit with my thoughts, quietly sipping her drink as I tried to make sense of the mess inside my head. I appreciated that about her. She didn't demand answers from me. She didn't expect me to feel a certain way. She was just there, like she had been through all of this. I guess I thought it would feel different, I finally admitted, leaning back in my chair. I thought seeing her suffer would make me feel better, but now that it's happened, I don't know. I don't feel anything. Juliet nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what I was saying. That's the thing about revenge. It never gives you what you really want. It's satisfying in the moment. But once the dust settles, it leaves you with more questions than answers. She was right, of course. I had spent so long thinking that destroying Carol's life would bring me closure, that it would somehow make up for everything she had done to me. But now that it was over, I realized that no amount of revenge could erase what had happened. It couldn't undo the months I spent in prison, or the betrayal I felt when I came home and found out she had moved on. There was no undoing any of it. That night, after Juliet and I parted ways, I found myself walking the streets of the city. It was late, the air cool and crisp, and the world felt strangely quiet. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what my next move was. Everything I had worked for, everything I had focused on was over. Mitch was gone. Carol was alone. But where did that leave me? I found myself standing outside the house again, the same place where this whole mess had started. The lights were off, the house dark and quiet. I couldn't bring myself to go to the door, couldn't face her. Instead, I just stood there, staring at the place that used to be my home, and wondered how things had gone so wrong. I had spent so much time blaming Carol for everything, so much time convincing myself that she was the villain in this story, that I hadn't really thought about my own part in it. Maybe it wasn't as simple as I had made it out to be. Maybe it wasn't just about her betrayal. Maybe there were cracks in our relationship long before I had left. Maybe I had been running away from something too. As I stood there, I realized something that I hadn't let myself admit until now. I didn't want revenge anymore. I didn't want to keep fighting, keep tearing things down. I wanted to move on. I wanted to find some kind of peace, some way to rebuild my life, and let go of all the anger I had been carrying with me. I didn't know if that was possible, but I knew I had to try. The next morning, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around for the next piece of Carol's life to fall apart. I wasn't going to sit on the sidelines and watch her suffer. I was done with all of it. It was time to take control of my own life again. Juliet was surprised when I told her. "Are you sure?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "You don't want to see this through?" I shook my head. Number, I'm done. I don't need to see anymore. I've had enough. She didn't argue. She just nodded, giving me that small, knowing smile of hers. I get it. You've been through a lot, Simon. It's time to move on. And for the first time in a long time, I agreed with her. For the first time since I returned home, I felt like I was taking back control of my life. It was strange, walking away from all the chaos and revenge that had consumed me for months, but it also felt freeing. I had spent so much time living in the past, trapped by anger and resentment, that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply live. The decision to stop was easier than I thought it would be. I expected some sort of inner conflict, a sense of unfinished business, but there was none. I had done enough. More than enough. Carol's life had crumbled, Mitch was out of the picture, and the damage was done. What more could I possibly gain from watching her suffer? The truth was, I wasn't that person anymore. Juliet was supportive of my decision. She had been with me through the worst of it, guiding me, helping me pull the strings, but she never pushed me to go further than I wanted. And now that I had decided to stop, she respected that. Still, I couldn't help but notice the change in her since that night. The same way I had been caught up in my own mission, Juliet had become invested in it too. And now, with it all behind us, there was a kind of void, something unspoken hanging between us. One evening, after we decided to take a break from everything, I found myself at Juliet's apartment again. The mood was different this time. We weren't going over documents or plotting the next move. We were just sitting together, a bottle of wine between us, letting the weight of everything slowly fade into the background. For once, the conversation wasn't about Carol or Mitch. It was just us. I hadn't realized how much I needed this, to just talk, to relax, to feel like a normal person again. Juliet had been my rock through all of this. But in the quiet of that night, something shifted. I found myself looking at her in a different light. Maybe it was the way she smiled at me, or the way her laughter seemed to break through the heaviness that had been surrounding us for so long. But for the first time in months, I felt something real, something hopeful. "You've changed," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "I mean, since you got back. You're different now." I shrugged, unsure of what to say. "I guess that's what happens when you go through hell and come out the other side." Juliet nodded, but there was something deeper in her gaze. "Yeah, but it's more than that. You're not as angry anymore. It's like you've finally let go of something." I hadn't thought about it like that, but she was right. The anger, the bitterness, it had been driving me for so long that I hadn't even noticed when it started to slip away. I wasn't the same person who had returned from that prison, hell-bent on revenge. I had changed. And maybe that was the point. "I guess I have," I admitted. "I don't know, I don't want to be that person anymore. I want to move on." Juliet smiled, a soft, understanding smile that made my heart beat a little faster. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Simon." Those words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. There was something unspoken in the silence, something that had been building for a while now. I didn't know what it was exactly, but I felt it, and I knew she did too. I reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Her fingers intertwined with mine, and suddenly, everything felt different. The past, the pain, the revenge, it all seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of us, sitting there, holding on to something real. "Juliet," I started, but I wasn't sure where I was going with it. The words seemed to get stuck in my throat. A million things I wanted to say, but didn't know how. She squeezed my hand gently, her eyes never leaving mine. "You don't have to say anything, Simon. I'm here." And that was enough. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I needed to prove anything. Didn't feel like I had to fight to survive. With Juliet, I could just be. She understood me in a way no one else did, and that was more than I could have ever asked for. That night was the first time I slept soundly in months. No nightmares, no waking up in a cold sweat, no memories of prison or betrayal haunting me, just peace. Over the next few weeks, I started to rebuild, slowly, carefully. I moved out of the apartment I'd been staying in and found a new place. A small, modest apartment on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. It was the first step towards starting fresh, and it felt good. Liberating, even. I cut ties with the old life I had left behind. Carol and Mitch were just distant memories now, no longer occupying space in my head. I didn't care what happened to them after everything that went down. It was their mess to deal with, not mine. I had no intention of getting involved in their lives again. They were just part of the past, and I was done with the past. Juliet and I grew closer. We spent more time together, not as two people plotting revenge, but as friends. Maybe something more than that. We hadn't defined it yet, but whatever it was, it felt right. It wasn't rushed or complicated. It was simple, easy. One afternoon, as we sat in a cafe, sipping coffee and talking about anything but the chaos we had gone through, Juliet looked at me with that same soft smile she always gave when she was about to say something important. "You're going to be okay, you know that, right?" she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. I nodded. "Yeah, I think I'm starting to believe that." She leaned back in her chair, a satisfied look on her face. "Good, because I think we both deserve a little peace after everything." And she was right. We did deserve peace. After everything we had been through, after all the pain and betrayal, the revenge and destruction, it was time to let it all go. Time to move on. As we walked out of the cafe that day, hand in hand, I realized something important. I wasn't defined by what had happened to me. I wasn't just the guy who got betrayed or the guy who came back for revenge. I was more than that. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a future for myself. One that wasn't clouded by anger or bitterness. Maybe this was what it meant to move on. To let go of the past and start over. To find peace, not in revenge, but in something real. In love. In friendship. In a life that was finally mine again. Weeks turned into months, and the remnants of my old life slowly faded away. I wasn't the same man who had been consumed by revenge, nor was I the broken person who had walked out of that prison with nothing but anger and bitterness. I had found something else, something better, and I had Juliet to thank for a lot of that. Juliet became my anchor in ways I never could have imagined. It wasn't just about the revenge, or the fact that she had helped me through the darkest time of my life. It was something deeper. We shared a connection that went beyond the chaos we had experienced together. It was built on understanding, on trust, and most importantly, on the fact that we had both been broken by life and found a way to rebuild ourselves. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I had been missing in my relationship with Carol. With Juliet, there were no pretenses, no expectations of who I should be or how I should act. I didn't have to pretend, didn't have to hide parts of myself. She saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and that was enough. One evening, as we sat on the small balcony of my new apartment, watching the sun set over the city, Juliet turned to me with a smile that made my heart ache in the best possible way. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Think about what?" I replied, though I had a feeling I knew where this was going. "Everything that happened," she said, gesturing vaguely. "Carol, Mitch, the revenge. All of it. Do you ever regret it?" I paused, considering her question. Did I regret it? There had been times, in the middle of the chaos, when I had questioned what I was doing. There had been moments when I wasn't sure if revenge was worth it, when I wondered if I had lost myself in the process. But in the end, it had led me here, to this moment, with Juliet by my side, and I couldn't regret that. "I don't know," I admitted. I mean, maybe in the beginning I did. When I first came home, all I could think about was how much I wanted to hurt Carol for what she did to me. But now, I don't think I regret it. It brought me here, and I'm grateful for that. Juliet smiled, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "Yeah, me too." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky darken and the city lights flicker on below. It was peaceful, a kind of quiet I hadn't known in years. For so long, my life had been filled with noise, anger, betrayal, chaos. But now, sitting here with Juliet, All of that felt like it belonged to someone else. It was behind me. The past didn't define me anymore. I think I'm ready, I said suddenly, surprising even myself with the words. Juliet turned to me, her brow furrowed in curiosity. Ready for what? To start over, I said, the realization sinking in as I spoke. I've been holding on to so much. Everything with Carol, everything that happened. But I think I'm finally ready to let it go. To really move on. She nodded, understanding immediately. You've already started, Simon. Look at where you are now. You've come so far from where you were. I guess I have, I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. But now I want to make it real. I don't want to be the guy who was wronged, the guy who came back for revenge. I just want to be me, whoever that is, now. Juliet reached for my hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. You'll figure it out, and I'll be right here with you, whatever comes next. For the first time in what felt like forever, I believed her. I believed that there was a future for me, one that wasn't defined by the mistakes of the past or the need for vengeance. I could be more than that. I could rebuild. And I wasn't doing it alone. Over the next few months, I started to find a rhythm in my new life. The anger I had carried with me for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. I threw myself into work, focusing on rebuilding my career and making plans for the future. But it wasn't just about work. For the first time in a long time, I started to make time for the things that really mattered. Time with Juliet, time for myself, time to just live. The scars of the past were still there, of course. I wouldn't forget what had happened, the pain I had gone through. But those scars didn't control me anymore. They were just a part of my story, not the whole of it. Carol tried to contact me once, not long after Mitch left. It was an email, short, apologetic. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but she did try to explain herself. She talked about how hard things had been after I disappeared, how lost she had felt, how she had convinced herself that I wasn't coming back. There was regret in her words, but it didn't change anything. It didn't matter. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. Carol had made her choices, and I had made mine. We were different people now, on different paths. Her part in my story was over, and I was okay with that. I didn't need closure from her. I had already found it within myself. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one evening when Juliet and I were sitting on the same balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. It was quiet, peaceful, and I felt a sense of contentment that I hadn't known in years. Juliet turned to me, a playful smile on her lips. So, what's next for you, Simon? What's your big plan? I laughed, shaking my head. I'm not sure yet. But for the first time, I'm okay with that. She leaned in closer, her eyes warm and full of affection. Whatever it is, I'm with you. And that was all I needed to hear. Because for the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare me. It didn't feel uncertain or out of reach. It felt open, full of possibility, and I wasn't walking into it alone. I was ready for whatever came next.